I just wondered if you felt at all any more optimistic about Cancun than about Copenhagen last year.
That's about one point. So the question was whether or not I felt any more optimistic about Cancun, the climate summit this time around, it's coming up at the end of this month, than I did about Copenhagen. And it's actually quite a difficult question, because I think Copenhagen suffered from so many expectations that it was going to always be quite hard to deliver on those expectations, and so there was incredible pressure on Copenhagen. Cancun is almost suffering from the opposite problem. I mean, you know, no one's talking about it. And so trying to see a silver lining, maybe, I mean, this doesn't entirely intuitive, because one would think that when there's more pressure, there might be, you know, more of a momentum to get an agreement. But maybe if there's slightly less pressure on saying there has to be this global agreement that's binding at Cancun, if people looked at some of the steps towards that, then maybe we can make at least some concrete process. So, for example, on climate financing, on forestry, there does seem to be some momentum behind separate agreements on that. So, on the one hand, you can say yes, we may get more than we did at Copenhagen because we'll actually get 2 agreements on forestry and on climate financing. So, on the one hand, you can say that's positive, and it's quite hard because you know it is positive, but actually in the global scheme of things of what we need, it is still pitiful, and so it's quite hard to sort of keep those dual realities in your head. That, you know, on the one hand, you've got the climate scientists really saying that the next 8 to 10 years is going to be critical in terms of using that window of opportunity to get emissions to peak and to start to come down. Because what matters is the cumulative effect of emissions in the atmosphere. So it doesn't work to say, oh, we'll sort the economic crisis out now and we'll worry about climate change in 10 or 15 years. Because that 10 and 15 years of extra emissions in the atmosphere, you know, really matters. You can't get it out again at that point. And that could be what tips us into into getting over 2 degrees. So I'd want to be really upbeat tonight, and I'm struggling a little bit. But I mean, concrete agreements on those 2 things will be really, really helpful. But I just do think there needs to be more pressure. We need to get it back into the headlines. You know, the reason there were only 12 MPs at that debate was because people aren't feeling pressured in their surgeries. It's not in the media. People have forgotten about it, and somehow it needs to get back up there as a key issue, I think.
Gentleman there, and then Les.
What do you think is the main barrier to action on climate change being taken by everyone? Anyone? Countries, companies? It doesn't seem to be really kicking in on a massive scale.
The main barrier, I think the public's a bit confused, quite understandably, because on the one hand you've got several prime ministers who've said it's the greatest threat that we face, and then frankly do bugger all about it, and so that's quite hard to sort of, you know, get in your head. There's that sense if you're doing your own personal action, then if your next door neighbour is flying off, you know, for several cheap holidays on the plane, then you know, it is undermining for people to think, well, why am I, you know, deciding to turn my thermostat down and wear a few more woolly jumpers if the person next door is, in a sense, offsetting what you're doing by not acting similarly. So I think partly it's to do with a lack of shared endeavour. And what I found quite interesting looking at is comparing it to the Second World War. If you're trying to think of when was the last time the country really had to do something quite remarkable in very difficult circumstances, it was the Second World War. And it's quite interesting to look back at some of the communications methods that were used then, because it wasn't self-evident that everybody realised, yes, there's a threat, we must all have rationing, we must all put up our blackout curtains and all the rest of it. Actually, there was a really concerted campaign that had to be run by governments to persuade people that we were all in this together, that it really was a threat. I mean, obviously a bit later in the war it was clear, but in the earlier days it was less clear. And, you know, it's interesting, for example, that all public buildings had to put on externally, on the walls of their buildings, how much energy they were using, how much energy they stopped using, reduced, you know, so there was a sense that governments had to make this effort, everybody had to make an effort. And maybe some way of trying to get back to that kind of sense of everybody being in it together would be through something like carbon rations. I mean, there are different phrases and terms used for it, domestic tradable quotas, it's sometimes called, but essentially what it would be, in its simplest form, for example, would be that everybody would be entitled to use a certain amount of energy, and particularly for, say, heating your home and for putting petrol in your car, for example, and it would be swiped off your allocation like a credit card or something like that. And it sounds complicated, but there has been quite a lot of work done on it. David Miliband was quite interested in the idea when he was Environment Minister, and he commissioned some more research on it. And there are researchers out there, you know, looking at how this could all work. But it seems to me that unless everyone does sense that we're in it together, it is going to be hard to get the momentum in the developed countries. In the developing countries, I think it is about the finance, about the technology, about that sense of, you know, how can they possibly believe that the West is going to be serious and deliver on the pledges that we've made, because we've got a pretty bad record of delivering on pledges to date. It doesn't look like we're taking it all that seriously, and so I think you can quite understand to some extent why some developing countries are sort of dragging their feet a bit. But having said that, you know, although it makes me very cross sometimes when, you know, ministers will say, well, Britain only accounts for 2% of climate emissions, so it wouldn't make any difference if we all, you know, did the right things. We're only accounting for 2%. Well, there are two sort of responses to that. One is, if you look at the embedded carbon that we're responsible for, because we basically offshored most of our most damaging production processes to places like China. So if you looked at imports and you worked out how much embedded carbon was involved in those imports, then we're responsible for a heck of a lot more. If you look at the amount that the companies that are indexed on the FTSE 100 are involved in, then that's an awful lot more. So firstly, it's not just 2%. And secondly, quite interestingly, in places like China, there is a growing recognition that there's actually a competitive advantage for their industries to be going a bit further on this. And so there are examples of even places where we're constantly told that it's a, you know, environmental nightmare, that they are actually making some quite positive progress.
Les?
Les Gumby, I've been involved with Hanover Action for Sustainable Living. I'm really pleased that Caroline could come here today to talk with us. I think, Caroline, the thing that I've heard tonight from you that's kind of shocked me the most is the point about the MPs and the idea that you know, the most important issue facing humans, facing the planet, 12 of our elected representatives turn up to debate the next step in the process. So frankly, I'm shocked and disgusted. And what I would like to ask you, and what I hope we can get from this meeting, as a group of people who've come together locally to try and take action and be positive, and all the, you know, all the things that you're talking about, and acknowledging a lot of the stuff that's going on in Brighton already. What I'd like to hear a bit more from you about is what we as a local action group could do. What kind of things should we be putting up onto our flip charts as practical things to work on over the next year or so?
Well, I feel it's a bit sort of presumptuous of me to come in and tell you what you should be working on, and I'm sure there are lots of really good ideas already there. I mean, I would say that whatever they are, make sure there's an ample amount of fun in them. I mean, I think that you know, everything that I've learned about what's been successful when groups have come together is when there's, you know, plenty of time for enjoying yourself alongside it. I mean, that's not to belittle what you're doing, but I think, you know, if it becomes something that is just only a chore and you feel like you're just doing it on your own, then you lose momentum for doing it. You know, there's some really interesting stuff. For example, in West Oxfordshire, they came together, probably a group of roughly the same size, and they made some grants to get some money for putting some renewable energy on the what you call turbines on the local estuary. And we don't have a local estuary in Brighton, but I think that the fact that we're moving towards this system and having the feed-in tariffs could mean that, for example, for a local school, you might be looking at, you know, could you use the roof of the local school for some solar panels? Is there some way of using that in a cooperative way? So there's some of the big stuff out there, and there is advice out there on how to do that. But then again, you know, maybe it's about finding some, you know, someone who's I mean, just really small things, but, you know, someone who can't cope with their garden, or who else can help them go in there and grow things that, you know, that can be shared more widely in the community, for example. I mean, there are, I don't want to give ideas, because I'm sure there are hundreds of ideas here, but just make sure that whatever it is about keeping the community strong and together, and it is about something that is good fun along the way as well. But there is a lot of advice out there, I would just really say, and lots of really good ideas that people are already doing. And if you look at that West Oxfordshire one in particular, I think that one's a really good example.
Thanks. Any more questions? Sarah, and then...
Yeah, I just wondered if you thought there was a stronger partnership to be made with people campaigning around third world poverty and hunger, because it seems to me there's more and more evidence coming out that climate change is going to be the thing that really impacts on hunger in the world, and that actually, you
I think that's a really good point, and I do think that in recent years the development organisations have got much better at recognising that climate change is the biggest threat to basically rolling back lots of the progress that they've been making over many years. And if I just think about sort of my surgeries, then in fact there have been more people coming from a development background, people from Christian aid groups or WDM groups or whatever, who've been coming to me saying, you know, please make sure there's a strong climate deal, even than they're having from the environment groups, which is kind of good news in a sense. So I think that marrying up is beginning to happen, and it needs to happen more, as you say. And it needs to, I mean, as well, there's been some quite interesting meetings between, you know, the campaign against climate change and the unions, for example, because increasingly, you know, unions are recognising that, you know, the future of their jobs, you know, the jobs are going to have to be sustainable ones, essentially. And so they need to get involved in how we move towards a greener economy with green jobs and make sure that we have what they call, you know, a just transition, so that workers are supported and retrained into more sustainable livelihoods and economies. So I think the more that we can join it up and make it a, you know, a cross-cutting campaign, not just an environmental campaign, then the better it is. And I was really struck by the fact that the government produced its security strategy a few weeks ago, the National Security Strategy. And, you know, anything about climate change, which, you know, on another day of the week, Prime Ministers will say is the greatest threat that we face to our security, you know, was about 0.25 in their National Security Strategy. And if we need to reframe it, I mean, going back to that sense of common endeavour that was around the Second World War, we need to reframe this as a major security issue. And the difficulty is that we're not very good at responding to these slightly more long-term, gradual security threats. You know, if there was a force invading in Dover, you know, the governments would kind of recognise it, they'd notice, and they'd do something about it. Because it's a sort of a longer-term, slow burn issue, then it's just like our reflexes don't work in the same way. And I'm sure you've heard the sort of analogy of the frog, that if you put a frog in boiling water, it jumps out because it notices it's very hot. And were you mean enough to put a frog in cold water and heat it very slowly, the story goes that the frog dies. I don't know who ever did this, but anyway, because it doesn't notice the gradual heating up of the water. And we're very much like the frogs in that second scenario, and so it's about how we kind of wake people up to the fact that this is really happening, and it's happening now.
You wanted to say?
I just wondered what you thought about the Edgeley Green Biofuels power station that's proposed for Shoreham Harbour, and the impact that will have on indigenous forests, and basically really covered in
So the question was about the biofuels plant that is planned for Shoreham, and to the extent that what they're talking about is biofuels that are going to be coming from other places. In other words, you know, I think agrofuels is a better word in a way, because sorry?
They're applying for it under bio.
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose what I'm saying is people sometimes think bio is a nice thing, and so it's quite clever to call it biofuels, so it doesn't sound so bad. Whereas, you know, in many cases what's being talked about, as we know, is decimation of forests, and there's plenty of evidence that suggests in some scenarios the amount of carbon that's released by the acquisition of the original biofuel product, if you like, is greater than the emissions that are saved through using biofuels rather than petrol. So, I mean, I'm absolutely in favour of saying that Shoreham needs some regeneration, but it's just such a tragedy to do it in a way that's probably going to be extremely environmentally damaging. You know, how much better if we were using Shoreham to really be the, you know, the spearhead for the renewable technologies that we need, the marine energy, the offshore wind farm that we are hopefully going to get very soon. But that's the kind of industry that we need, I think, rather than the biofuels.
Any more? So at the front here, and then Jackie.
Can I just ask your views on nuclear power? Because I know some environmentalists have had a bit of a turnaround.
Only a very few. I am absolutely dead against nuclear power for the reason that it's not only that we've got all of the issues around waste, the fact we still don't know what to do with waste, the fact that at a time when we're told that we need to part with all kinds of civil liberties because of the terrorist threat, if you've got more and more nuclear power stations, then you've got more targets for terrorists. And let's not forget that one of those 9/11 planes was on its way to a nuclear power station and thankfully didn't get there, but if it had have done, the impact of that would have been huge. But it's not just, but it's also that if you look at that time frame I was talking about in terms of how do we most quickly get our emissions down, then nuclear just doesn't help us. It's going to take 10 or 15 years minimum to get new nuclear up and running. And if you were to think, how do I get the biggest bang for my buck in that time, then although it's less sexy and less interesting, then energy efficiency, I'm sorry, but lagging your loft and doing your windows and doing that on a systematic street-by-street basis would be cheaper, it would be much, much more effective in reducing our energy use. It would have far better social impacts, it would be far safer, and just better. You know, if it were really the case that there was no option, it was either climate change or nuclear, then of course nuclear would probably be the lesser of the two evils, but that is not the choice that we're facing at the moment. You know, there is plenty of evidence out there that if you use renewables, if you use energy efficiency, we'd still have to use some more gas as a kind of bridging technology, but use it in combined heat and power, so you're capturing the energy that you're currently sending up cooling towers or losing along the transmission lines, and you capture that for district heating, for example. There's lots of research out there that simply suggests we don't need nuclear. And just while I'm on this hobby horse, the thing that makes me most furious is when the government says, don't worry, we won't put any public money into nuclear, we won't do it unless it can be done without public subsidy. That is the biggest lie they could possibly tell, because it is completely inconceivable that if there was some kind of nuclear accident, that the government's going to sit on its hands and say, well, actually, we said we weren't going to bail you out, so we'll just watch this radiation as it drifts across the country. Nuclear doesn't have to pay full amounts of money for the liabilities. If you look at liability insurance, then again it only has to pay a certain amount, and the government will then step in after that certain amount has been used. If you look at the kind of pricing mechanisms, again, government is supporting lots of those. So it is a massive diversion of resources that could be going into better, faster, more effective technologies. In a nutshell.
Jackie, you want?
I think you might have already covered it actually. It's just about the multinationals really, the amount of money that they want to make. It seems to be the pressure from shareholders and making money. To me personally feels like the biggest thing that's forcing people to consume more. Not forcing them, but that's, I mean, I personally feel I do my bit, but then when I look at big multinationals, I think there's nothing making them sort of save on energy, produce less rubbish, pollute the environment less, and all that kind of thing. And the similar thing about food, you know, apparently we do have enough food in the world to feed everybody, but there's no political will for the distribution of it. And, you know, I don't know how you tackle these things, but it always seems to come down to money in the end. And is there some way of pressurising multinationals and these kind of corporations that seem to be polluting the planet and making people poorer everywhere, really?
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. I mean, I think you're absolutely right when you said that what's missing is the political will, because these companies haven't got all of those powers by accident. They've got them because essentially governments have ceded them those powers, and you've seen it time after time at World Trade Organization meetings, that they have basically given those powers to multinationals, and then when multinationals do something that the public doesn't like, governments say, oh, well, sorry, nothing to do with us, you know, what can we do? They've got the power to do it. You know, I think we should be using monopoly laws far more effectively so that you don't let some of those companies get so huge in the first place. I think we need to be changing some of the company law so that the first duty of a company is not its fiduciary duty to get profits for its shareholders, it's actually a much wider duty to the wider community and so on. There are all kinds of wonderful codes of conduct that have been drawn up from the UN to, you know, all kinds of different environment development, human rights groups, Amnesty and others, which if the political will were there, they have fantastic legal frameworks that they're proposing, which would absolutely limit the power of companies to get away with the kinds of things that they do. And it does come back to the political will to do it.
I did hear something on the gradualistic that suggested that now most countries are being forced into a position where they're having to compete for multinationals to register in their country so that they can scrounge the smaller, well, the large amounts of corporation tax. Apparently, corporation tax in this country usually is something like 53% in 85, and now it's about 28%. I'm not sure of the exact figures. But while companies can register in Dublin and Switzerland and places, this thing I heard suggested that all these countries are now competing for the multinationals to register in their country so that they can get the few billion pounds of tax.
I think the problem is that
I don't really know what the solution to that is.
Well, I think the problem is, on the one hand, you've got the global reach of the multinationals, and on the other hand, you don't have any global governance system that can hold them to account.
Yeah.
And while that's still the case, we have to rely on national governance systems. And it seems to me that one quite effective policy would be to have what's called a site here to sell here policy. In other words, if you've got a multinational that wants to sell its widgets in Britain, then it can jolly well put its plant in Britain and therefore be subject to British law, rather than being able to base itself in the country that has the least effective environmental and social policies, and then just spend a huge amounts of money exporting stuff to us. I mean, I'm spending money in the sense of money of transporting widgets from A to B. A site here to sell here policy would be a way of taking power away from some of those companies. It wouldn't always be appropriate, but for a lot of companies it would be. And again, there's been some thought about how that could actually be put into practice. And so I'm sorry to keep coming back to this issue of political will, but so much of it comes down to that.
They're quite complicated issues.
They are complicated.
For people to ask their MPs to do something like that, it takes a lot of knowledge of the small details. I mean,
Sure.
Companies seem to employ quite clever tax evading people to tell them how they can save billions, and for us to be able to understand what all that's about is quite difficult.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think that's why campaigns like the Tax Justice Network, or indeed the Robin Hood tax and things like that, are doing fantastic work in kind of demystifying some of this stuff, because it suits companies for this stuff to be incredibly complicated, because the more complicated it is, the more they can get away with it. If we can actually, boil it down to some of its essentials and get popular campaigning groups to pick this issue up, as indeed WDM, as I say, and the Tax Justice Network, Robin Hood tax campaign are doing, then admittedly it still takes someone the time to go and find out about them, but there are much more easily available concentrations of what this stuff is about that's much more simply put, that's in postcard form and everything else. And so I just really would encourage people to get involved in some of those campaigns, because I think they do make a difference.
I'm going to take two more questions then. So, the lady there and then Thurston.
Hi, Alison Walters, I'm the coordinator of the local Friends of the Earth group, and I'm shamelessly going to publicise our renewable energy event, which is on Tuesday next week. We're going to have a debate about renewable energy and the energy options that are happening around the city, so that should be quite exciting.
Where is it?
Do you want to say where
it's at the Brightham, no, not Brightham. Yes, the Brightham. I forgot. Something nodding. Yes, it's at the Brightham. I've completely got my question. Now, I wanted to make a point about a couple of points, really. I live in a rarefied green world, and lots of my friends are very green, and it's great, and we all have our little green thoughts together, but when I step outside that world, I find it quite scary, especially when I hear that only 12 MPs have gone to debate something like Cancun. So my question is, how do we get that political will back into Parliament? And you were saying about postcard campaigns. Now I hear kind of on the networks that MPs get fed up with postcard campaigns and being hassled by constituents. So are things like postcard campaigns still effective? How do we get our MPs? How do we get the other MPs in Brighton interested? Because we've had so-so responses back from the other two MPs in Brighton now. So yeah, that's really my question. How do we get that will at the political level? And also, I suppose I would say, if we're going to work on sustainability at a local level, we've got to involve everybody. And I think a lot of it is about civic pride and trying to get pride back in. I'm a waste campaigner by trade, and I look around the city and it's a mess. And I think a lot of that is if we can encourage people to take pride in it, then we start to really look at the ways of addressing those issues.
Can I take the other question as well?
Yeah, Thurston.
The greenest government ever was the pledge that I think Cameron made at the beginning of his government's term. What do you think they've got up their sleeve, if anything? And is it a political gift to you, or the rashest promise ever?
Or both. Can Can I do that one and then I'll come back to that one? Yes, the greenest government ever, and then the first thing they do is to abolish the Sustainable Development Commission, which was the very body that was tasked with telling them whether or not they were progressing towards sustainability, which was rather clever, because if you get rid of the body that was going to actually measure whether you achieved your commitment, then it's much easier to pretend that you have. And yeah, I think it's, from the Green Party's point of view, the more other parties talk about green things, I think it's a good thing, because we can then, unfortunately, usually point to the gap between what they've said and what they're actually doing. So it puts the environment, it puts green issues higher on the political agenda, and that's all to the good. To its credit, it's done a couple of good things, mostly before it actually, well, before the rot set in. Getting rid of Heathrow Airport was, the extra runway at Heathrow was a good idea. Spoiled slightly by Boris saying, don't worry, we'll build another one in the Thames Estuary, but we'll overlook that for the moment, so it hasn't happened. So I think, where it's politically useful to them to do it, they will dress up what is primarily an economic decision as a green one. But certainly seeing what they've done so far, if you look at the kinds of promises they've broken, that illegal logging one was a very early promise that they've broken from the coalition agreement. I think there's a lot of concern about the selling off of the woodlands, because there aren't proper legal guarantees that that land will remain safely and properly managed. The jury is still out, it's early days, but it's not looking that great to me, I would say. Going back to your question, which I was postponing only because I'm still hoping to come up with a lovely nugget of information that will just mean that we all go out of here saying, yes, we've got the answer. And it never is quite as simple as that. It is, talking to people that you don't normally talk to about these issues. It sounds really lame, but actually, for as long as we're all in our little green worlds, then that will remain until we start talking to other people who we perhaps wouldn't normally talk to about these issues. So it's about really making an effort to do that. What affects other MPs? I think going to the surgeries makes a difference. Being there and speaking on behalf of lots of other people, if you can make the case it's not just you, but actually you are speaking on behalf of a wider movement or a wider group of people or a community association or whatever it is, I think does concentrate MPs' minds, particularly MPs with quite small majorities, as some of us in the situation. But, so I think that's important. I do think that if people had been more in people's surgeries, if there had been, postcards aren't great, and certainly if it looks like it's, if it just looks like it's completely organised by one big organisation, and actually it's not really so much individuals, but it's been organised at a national level, then that's not so effective. But when it's ordinary people writing themselves with their addresses and all the rest of it, then I still think that is quite effective. It's a way of just demonstrating what your concerns are and what you're going to be measuring your MP's performance by when it comes to the time to do that. So I'm sorry I don't have the magic nugget. But I think it is using all of the tools that we always do use, but also perhaps making sure, as you say, that we try and get out of that green silo and make the links, using whatever language and whatever interests we think might reach out to other people. So if it is people who are concerned about development, then making the link between climate change and development. If it's people about jobs, then it's making the link about the numbers of green jobs and tackling the climate. If it's about public transport, or there are a whole range of concerns that people have, and most of them will be affected one way or another in the kind of green agenda that we're talking about. So I think it is about trying to reach out to them.
Well, thank you very much, and I think it's been a very interesting discussion.